Hello, everyone. Welcome to 99 zu 1. I will give a short intro before you can listen to this talk. We recorded this talk last Thursday. Our friend Jean Bajalan from This is Revolution podcast called me up and told me that we should get Kuba on board. And I was already aware that Kuba in the week before had made like half a dozen, maybe a dozen podcasts on the topic of the Ukraine crisis, as he's an expert for all things Ukraine and Eastern Europe, and especially regarding security issues. And of course, that thought had already crossed my mind, but as he had already done so many shows, I was first hesitant to contact him personally. But then I got the idea that maybe it makes sense for us to talk a little bit about Europe in this context. I mean, he has already, of course, talked about this topic a little bit, but not to the extent that we maybe could go into. So this podcast that we did basically gives a little bit of an overview of Kuba's analysis on what's happening in Ukraine and also what led up to the situation. And in the following, we talk a little bit about Germany's role. We talk a little bit about the situation in Great Britain, and also in the end, I think, close with a couple of words for Poland. Now, the reason why I'm doing this intro is that we were so excited to start talking, and I was also a little bit in a hurry because just before that I had an interview with Milton Alimadi going, and I came from one meeting room to the next meeting room, that I completely forgot to give an intro for my two friends, Jean and Kuba. And that's why I want to repeat that now before the conversation starts for you. So let's talk about Kuba Wrzesniewski. He is Dr. Kuba. And I think you will see that as a link also in this description, that he is on Twitter under this handle. And that's something that all of you should follow because it's super interesting, the analyses that he posts there. Kuba was born in Poland. He came as a refugee from the People's Republic after martial law was declared there. He came to Canada. And because of this personal history, he was always interested and motivated to learn more and to study the regional politics and history of Poland, Ukraine, Eastern Europe. That was his motivation, why he also then went on to earn a history degree at Harvard. He then started as an intern at the Atlantic Council, who sent him as an exchange personnel to the Foreign Ministry and Ministry of Defense in Warsaw. Coming back, he then finished his PhD in political science at Berkeley and studied security issues in Iraq in his thesis. He worked, and this is, I would say, highly unusual for someone working in the left podcasting sphere, but that's also one of the reasons why he's so incredibly valuable and interesting to listen to. He worked on a couple of DoD, Department of Defense projects, both in Washington, in Washington, D.C., and he worked on political, security, and economic issues, mostly for the DoD, but also for the U.S. Air Force. So that's also why he has like this quite unique insight into both the history and the geopolitics of the area, but also like, quite, let's say, firsthand or at least secondhand information of what's going on in these areas. And this is also why he's lovingly being called Deep State Kuba, as he apparently worked in the deep state. So let's come to Jean. Jean Bajalan, he's an assistant professor at Missouri State University. He's a historian of the Middle East, specializing in the rise of nationalism and the evolution of the Kurdish question. He completed his undergraduate degree in history and politics at the School of Oriental and African Studies, and he holds a Master of Science in Nationalism and Ethnicity from the London School of Economics, an MA in History from Istanbul Bilgi University, I think, and a doctor in philosophy in Oriental Studies from the University of Oxford. So also quite some credentials here. In addition to extensive research experience in both the British and Ottoman archives, Dr. Bajalan has taught both Middle Eastern and world history in a variety of different institutions, including at the University of Oxford, Istanbul Bilgi University, and the American University of Iraq Suleimani. Both of them have quite some unique views and analyses on the situation. So I really hope you enjoy this talk, and I'm looking forward to have both of them back. And with that, enjoy. Herzlich willkommen zu 99 zu 1. Welcome to 99 zu 1. And today we talk about Ukraine and Europe. And we have as guests Kuba Wrzesniewski. And I think I said that more or less correctly. Wrzesniewski.
More or less.
More or less, yes. And Djene Bajalan from the This Is Revolution crew, but also you're also on your own. I saw that Kuba gave like, I don't know, a gajillion podcasts last week, something like 12 or so.
Well, it just happened to be that this is an area where I've got some expertise that isn't broadly available, and I wasn't going to say no to anyone. Partly because I'm flattered just to be asked, and partly because I think that in this climate where there's so much pressure from the media, from Western governments, from Twitter libs to just go completely anti-Russia as a reaction to the invasion, that we should take stock and look at things as objectively as possible to figure out what sensible left position might be, and just so that people have the information to come to their own conclusions.
Yeah. I mean, and we are also in the middle of. I mean, that's one thing that we can't forget, even if we think of Putin started all of this out of the blue because he went crazy and has his grandest allures and stuff like that. We are still seeing ourselves as part of the conflict. It becomes obvious in the media that the media is also, drumming the drums and trying to move people to a certain agenda. So it becomes even more important to try to step back a little bit and just see what's happening. And that's really missing in Germany a lot. But yeah, we're already in the weeds. I actually want to start and ask you, how are you guys? Everything good? Djene, I think you are in England right now, right?
I am. I'm in beautiful sunny Hull. I went to see the North Sea today and looked over.
Is it still there?
It's still there. No mushroom clouds on the horizon. Watching the news, watching Kuba really give some excellent analysis and really do a great job, I think, over the last week or so, disentangling the important sort of technical questions and analysis based commentary from the moral questions. Of course, there are like moral dimensions to this conflict, but we should be wary of confusing the two when we try to make an objective assessment. I think Kuba's been doing an excellent job. And, just as a kind of what I keep thinking about when people criticize people like Kuba for giving that context is that, when I studied history at high school, one of the reasons given when we studied history that Hitler came to power was because of the policies taken by the Allies at the end of the First World War. One can recognize, strategic blunders or provocative moves that lead to a reaction without necessarily endorsing the type of reaction taken by an individual like Vladimir Putin today or an individual like Adolf Hitler back in the 1940s. We can recognize that context. So we have to disentangle those questions, and I've been really impressed with the way Kuba has coolly and calmly looked at this. And, I'm hoping that Matt Crispin will one day notice him for his
and then
Brit-
now
British-
Joe Rogan has
Joe Rogan. No,
Yeah,
Matt
yeah.
Christian is Kuba's guy. So I think those have been that's been really important, because a lot of the commentary, and I think Kuba would probably agree with me on this, is, of course, you have this liberal hysteria, which has been infected, of course, with this individualistic culture war nonsense, which has led to, you know, people talking about not reading Dostoevsky or not playing Tchaikovsky, or people pouring their vodka down the sink. This utterly ridiculous response to the actions of the Russian government. And then at the same time, you have a certain element of the left who were in the lead up to the war, and I made this mistake too, were like, this is all hysteria, this war's not really going to happen, this is just Western propaganda, and Putin's not going to attack, who have now flipped to the position of like, well, this is a right war, this is a just war, what do you expect
Right,
Putin to do?
right.
And again, have a kind of inverted morality to their analysis, where everything, nobody has any agency except for America, and everybody has to take the actions that they do, which I think is an equally unhelpful extreme of the debate. So I think when we discuss these things, and I'm not anywhere near the same kind of expert on this as Kuba, but when we discuss these things, we really have to disentangle our moral positions from this, from our objective understanding of what caused these events to happen, and because at the end of the day, I think in a macro sense, this war is not good for anybody, right? I don't think anybody is benefiting, or anything is going to be improved by the outcome of a war. But trying to, lead with the moral discussion without having a command of the facts is problematic.
I think it's interesting what you just said, and I just want to, maybe a question also then back to Kuba, because when it comes to looking at the reactions from the leftists, like you described right now, right? So at least here in Germany, I don't know how this is in the US, and I'm also not so much involved in American Twitter, so I don't also know how this looks online. But here in Germany, I do not see that second position that much, like this idea that this is a just war and it's morally justified. We have a lot of people, and quite a lot of people, that try against the grain to give some kind of contextual analysis. And that might be, it might be a flawed analysis. It might sometimes not be very well informed. It might sometimes just reproduce some talking points from here or there. But there is nearly nobody that I know of that says Putin is great, right? At least in the left bubble, I would say. But at the same time, all these people that are trying to give this geopolitical analysis, also just like Kuba is doing with much more competency, I would say, they are being attacked for exactly that narrative that you just brought, as you're siding with Putin, you're trying to contextualize something that cannot be contextualized because this is just evil, this is just morally bad. And there I'm always like, that's a straw man. And that's actually it's not a real argument. We are not really discussing here anymore, because when there is a mass killing spree happening in the school, and kids are being killed by a guy with a machine gun or something, this happened in Germany too, right? What's the first thing that happens? Okay, everybody's outraged, everybody's angry. But then in the second moment, we immediately try to ask, okay, what happened to this guy? Like, how did that happen? How did he evolve in this direction? So even if you take like the most evilest, morally, condemnable action, which is killing kids in a school, maybe, right? Even there, we normally try to understand what led to the situation. That's why I think like this discussion is actually not a discussion. It's not about actually, figuring out, should we look at the morals or at the material relation. It's more about that. That's actually what we are doing here. That's actually the culture war, or the information war, maybe.
So for me, one reason why I try to avoid injecting moral considerations into discussions of major geopolitical developments is that from the perspective of an analyst looking at great power relations, looking at security developments, there's no space for morality. These aren't decisions or policies that are implemented in order to serve some transcendent good. These are practical, often cynical, political games that have extraordinarily high stakes, and they have a internal logic that we can try to determine, try to discover, but nobody is behaving as a principally moral agent when it comes to NATO expansion or rearmament or different regime change operations. And the second reason is that because so much of what's done in the foreign policy and security space is reprehensible by any common sense morality, whether it's the behavior of the Assad regime against the Sunni majority, against the regions that were sympathetic to the anti-Assad resistance, or whether it's the anti-Assad resistance and their treatment of Shia, Alawite, religious minorities. It's all terrible. And somebody looking at it from the perspective of a newsreader or a concerned citizen with any humanitarian impulses hears these stories of horror coming from Syria, coming from Ukraine, coming from Iraq, coming from Yemen, and feels a tremendous pressure. Well, we should do something. We should do something. We should declare a no-fly zone. We should intervene. We should bomb the bad guys. Who are the bad guys? How can we bomb them? And that impulse can lead to extraordinarily disastrous outcomes. And the satisfaction that especially American viewers get, and especially American media people get, when they have their righteous war. I remember Brian Williams rhapsodizing over Trump's missile strikes into Syria, saying, quoting Leonard Cohen, "I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons." It's psychopathic, but that is an outlet for a certain kind of moral pressure that that these figures experience, observing but not being able to intervene. And often they make people feel better about themselves. They make people feel like something is happening to ameliorate the situation, while in reality, all that's happening is more death, more devastation, more destabilization. And the path to a better outcome, and I don't mean this from a better outcome for the West or a better outcome for Putin. I don't really care about either bloc's geopolitical interests and their score and their great game. I'm worried about Ukrainians. How many of them will be killed? How many of them will be displaced? How quickly before regular life can resume in Ukraine? And from that perspective, what we should get to as quickly as possible is a ceasefire and some kind of settlement, which will rectify the security situation, get heavy weapons out of the country, relieve the pressure on the cities, and allow life as quickly as possible to get back to normal for all of these people who have been badly impacted. And often that means doing things that look like appeasement or look like rewarding or rewarding bad behavior or neglecting serious crimes. But, one doesn't make peace with one's friends. And any resolution will require both the Ukrainian side and the Russian side to accept difficult concessions. And how can we get there? And how do we prevent another geopolitical catastrophe, humanitarian catastrophe like this from happening in the future? Those are the questions that I look at when I try to analyze situations like this.
Excellent. And I would like to come back maybe to how you already maybe have some answers there, or maybe some intuition on, okay, what should happen now, or how is it actually going on if that is our goal, or if that is the goal of the situation, let's say. But maybe, without going into such grand detail as you did last week for all these shows that you did, can you maybe for our listeners give us a little bit of like a short wrap up, as if that's possible at all? how did it come so far? How did it come to this? And especially where are we at right now? So after all of this, and like maybe some context and geopolitical context for this conflict, and then where are we at?
So the breakup of the Soviet Union was extraordinarily painful to Russia, and the loss of certain territories, the Central Asian states, to a certain extent the Baltics, to a certain extent the Caucasus, that felt like letting some foreigners go, or the independence of national units that didn't necessarily have a close kinship with the Russian nation, the Russian Federation, weren't part completely of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world. Ukraine, however, the relationship between Ukraine and Russia historically has been something like the relationship between Bavaria and the rest of Germany. It's a region with a very distinctive local culture and linguistic, a dialect at this point that is unique and has its own literature, its own tradition, but most people speak Russian. There's been extensive intermarriage. These two countries have been part of the same bloc since the Russian Empire, and with the exception of Western Ukraine, that was Polish between World War I and World War II. So for Russia, it was like the amputation of Bavaria from Germany, or of New England from the United States, that they have this integral connection with Ukraine, and it was ruptured. The Putin has played the role of the restorer of the Russian state. He's done that by stabilizing the country, reducing the power of the oligarchs, increasing the role of the central government, centralizing authority more and more in the Kremlin, as well as making Russia a formidable security force. And that the Ukrainian question is kind of the biggest one that was hanging over his legacy. With the end of the Soviet Union in Ukraine, you had these governments that were fairly cynical and opportunistic, a little like Lukashenko in Belarus. They get asked, Ukraine gets asked in 1989, 1990, do you want independence? And local elites see it as an opportunity. It's better to be leader of a country than number 2 or number 3 in a bigger unit. They rule incompetently, and you have the typical problems with oligarchs, with privatization, with mafia, very, very high corruption, very low governance capability or outcomes. And however, they balance between Russia and the West. This balancing act intensifies with the so-called color revolutions, the Orange Revolution, and is kind of a precursor to the Maidan Revolution. And in that moment, what Russia sees is a Ukraine which was slowly being pulled back to its rightful place, meaning within the Russian orbit. But that process derailed by an uprising that was supported certainly by Western agencies. Victoria Nuland became infamous for her role, and connived with certain elements of the anti-Russian Ukrainian far right to replace a pro-Russian, democratically elected, constitutionally sound government with one that was leaning to NATO, leaning to the West, and cutting all of its connections with Russia. That was a very dangerous development for Russia. For instance, the Russian Black Sea Fleet is based not in the Russian Federation, but in Sevastopol in Crimea, which meant that all of a sudden a hostile government is controlling one of your key naval bases. This is part of what provoked the takeover of Crimea and an attempt to prevent a stable pro-Western Ukraine from developing as an even larger threat. Russia sponsors the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And in those areas, Crimea and the Donbass, you do have large numbers of Russian speakers who don't necessarily relish being governed by Kiev, especially an anti-Russian government in Kiev. So those factors.
Is it the case that these people in Crimea, or maybe also in the Donbass, and I mean, we are talking about them as being ethnically Russian, while it's still difficult for me to disseminate if they're like, is there an ethnic difference between Ukrainians and Russians? But okay, let's say that they are ethnically Russians. So is that then part of the reason why they are not, looking forward to being governed by Ukraine, because they think that's like, is there an ethnical conflict going on there, or what is the background of this?
So so is Bavarian an ethnicity that's different from German?
I would say no, but my partner would
Austrian, but is Austrian different? For example, especially
I would also say no. But then again, I mean, it really depends on what you define as an ethnicity, right?
I think one of the important things to understand about ethnicity and national identity is that as much as nationalists attempt to provide a concrete, objective definition, these identities are always kaleidoscopic. They change over time. Individuals in the course of their own life people have multiple identities. Nationalism asks us to privilege a particular identity, and depending on political circumstances, people will juggle and rejig their identities depending on the political and social circumstances. They will even imagine their identities in different ways. You can talk about a Swiss nation, right? But if we look at the Swiss, we'd say, but there's 4 different languages spoken. We talk about an Indian nation where there are a myriad of different languages spoken. Yet, at the same time, we would think of the United States and England and Britain as being different nations, or Ireland and England as being different nations, despite the fact that they speak the same language. So ethnicity is an ideological construct. Nationality is an ideological construct which becomes more or less relevant depending on the circumstances. So at a time where you don't really have to choose your identity, you can sort of occupy a kind of middle ground where you can sort of be a little bit, let's say you're living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You could be a little bit Czech within one context, a little bit more Austrian German with another context. But obviously, when conflicts harden, people are suddenly forced to pick between their identities. So when you look at the Ukraine, let's say the Ukrainian identity is a spectrum, right, between a Western Ukraine, which has a stronger linguistic peculiarity different from Russia, towards a central region where you have a largely Russophone population, but people who identify as being part of the Ukrainian tradition. And then you move towards the east, where the sense of distinctiveness from Russia is, for a host of different historical reasons, migration, assimilation, is a lot less strong. And if we look at Ukraine today, we see, for example, I would speculate that one of the outcomes of this war is going to be a hardening of a distinctive Ukrainian identity and a less of ability to kind of be, to occupy a kind of intermediary position where you can sort of take parts of both identities, because these identities change. Just look at Britain. at the formation of the British identity, at the vanguard of the formation were the Scots. And today, at the vanguard of the dissolution of the British identity are the Scots. So I think it's really important to give up on any kind of attempt to provide an objective answer to what people's ethnicity and nationality are, beyond stating that they change and harden and people pick sides. And in a conflict, suddenly it matters whether you identify primarily as a Russian or primarily as a Ukrainian. I mean, in previous times, that wasn't so difficult. I remember, for example, I met somebody from Croatia who said they identified as a Croatian Serb, right? But that identity doesn't exist anymore because it's been obliterated by the historical process. And I think, and maybe Kuba will know better, the more Russian-inclined regions of Ukraine are becoming more Russian and identifying with Russia, whereas those that are not inclined towards Russia are increasingly seeing themselves as very distinct from the Russian nationality.
Yeah, I'd say that process of hardening is exactly what we're seeing in Ukraine right now. Under this old Soviet system, there was an umbrella identity, the idea of Soviet man, that allowed people to transcend ethnicity. Russian was Soviet, a Georgian was Soviet, Bashkir, Ukrainian, all Soviets. With the dissolution of that transnational ideological identity, people fall back into linguistic and cultural notions of who they are. In Ukraine, that gets complicated because of a high level of immigration of Russians, a high level of intermarriage, the fact that the languages are mutually intelligible, and also the fact that most Ukrainians, people who self-identify as Ukrainian by ethnicity, speak Russian rather than Ukrainian. The West is the heartland of the Ukrainian language. Elsewhere, people basically have to learn it. It's a little like Irish in Irish Gaelic in Ireland, where the colonial experience was so effective at transferring the language that the local language needs active policy in order to revive it outside of this Western Ukrainian homeland. And Crimea was never part of Ukraine proper. It was a Tatar Khanate until it was conquered by the Russian Empire. And when it was settled, following that conquest, it was settled primarily by Russians rather than by Ukrainians from further north.
So would you say that this is also then the reason why, I mean, back then when the referendum was held inside the population of Crimea, it was apparently, I mean, this is Russian reporting, so we can't be sure, but there was apparently like a 90% majority for the separation from Ukraine and the annexation. Is that
I mean, it was probably plausible, you know, I mean, maybe not 98%, but it was probably plausible that there was a majority in that region, not just for ethnic reasons, but also employment. You know,
precisely.
The Black Sea Fleet is not a small fleet.
Right.
And the Russians have attempted in the post-Soviet era to maintain themselves as a naval power. And so, you know, many people in that region have connections to or like either first degree or second degree connections to the Russian Navy. So, you know, there's lots of reasons for that. And also, and as Kuba points out, that region has if you look at regions like the Crimea and also Odessa, those are regions that were captured by the Russians with the decline of the Ottoman Empire. So they were integrated into the Russian Empire at a later period. And as Kuba says, their process of settlement was distinct. They weren't settled by Ukrainian Cossacks spreading out over the land. They were captured in war, and then a deliberate imperial policy to settle them was enacted. And the people who were settled were people from the imperial heartland. Just as in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they would dump a bunch of Germans down in a frontier zone next to the Ottoman Empire, or a bunch of Hungarians.
Reliable people.
Reliable, reliable populations. In fact, the Russians would occasionally dump Germans as a reliable people. And to speak to Kuba's point about the importance of the dissolution of this supranational Soviet identity, Ukraine is not the only place where this problem has raised its head. We just witnessed a war in Armenia, Azerbaijan,
right,
which that conflict is obviously, predates the Soviet Union, but the existence of the Soviet Union as a kind of upper level of identity and certain policies undertaken by the Soviet Union to a certain degree mitigated the potential ethnic conflict. When suddenly Armenia and Azerbaijan became independent, then suddenly the status of Nagorno-Karabakh became like a live issue for the population. So one of the arguments I always have with Scottish nationalists about breaking up the union is like, I don't care about breaking up Britain for any emotional reasons, but suddenly if you break up the union, you have to ask questions of what passport, who gets to have a passport, who gets the British passport, who gets the Scottish passport, who gets to vote in what country. So you create a whole bunch of administrative issues which can lay the foundation for a greater conflict. And as Ukraine was moving more and more out of the Russian orbit, one of the problems is the emergence of a bureaucratic barrier separating the two countries, making it hard to live in the intermediate space between these two identities in a very concrete way. So there are pro-Russian elements of the population. The problem for the Russians, if you ask me, and Kuba, perhaps you know this better than I, by annexing the Crimea and basically de facto separating the Donbass from the rest of the country, they shifted the political balance of power in the country decisively in favor of pro-Western elements of the Ukrainian political elite, and that set off a whole cascade of problems in terms of Russia attempting to exercise influence and roll back the advance of not only Western military alliances, but Western capital, Western economic and political integration. And from the Ukrainian perspective, if you're looking at it objectively, where do you want to rather have a connection with? Going to Moscow or going to Berlin?
We're going to talk about this in a second, because that's a really interesting point. But maybe that point that you just brought up, I think that's a really interesting one. And I also want to stay with Crimea in a second. But Kuba, can you elaborate on this idea that, it's actually an interesting idea that you split out these Russian dominated, let's say, ethnically dominated areas, and by this, what you're creating in Ukraine as a whole is a population that is less Russian oriented as a total, right? At the same time, I think that is also part of the reason why Russia was insisting for so long for the Minsk Treaty to be upheld, because I think part of that was for these independent republics, as they were not called that by then, but for them to actually have some parliamentary say or some more parliamentary power in the Ukrainian parliament, and thereby re-establish basically this Russian influence on Ukrainian politics.
The goal of Minsk nominally was to reintegrate the Donbass into a federal Ukraine, where those pro-Russian regions would have more autonomy and serve as potential veto players against any kind of security relationship with the West, which is one reason why the Ukrainians never really upheld their part of the Minsk agreements. And the Russians didn't either, but one can't fault either side particularly for the failure of those talks, since both sides tried to hold the other to their obligations while ignoring what was required of their own side.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this miscalculation, I think, by Putin of the second order effects of taking Crimea and Donbass, which is you end up with a Ukrainian electorate in the regions that are left over that is more nationalist, that no longer has these millions of Russian voters that would mitigate some of the more nationalist tendencies. And the way that some of the far right groups, not even the far right groups, but some of the security forces within Ukraine discuss Crimea, the way that NATO actually encourages Ukraine to discuss Crimea, is kind of the way that Serbs envisioned Kosovo, even though the population is not really yours, in the sense that they've opted to leave. They don't speak the same language. They don't necessarily share that kinship with Ukraine. You're going to make it a symbolically central battleground, right? That we're going to get Crimea back for Ukraine. This is going to be our heroic struggle. We can't let those Russians push us around. And that led to the drafting of official Ukrainian defense policy documents that planned for the recapture of Crimea, how we're going to take it back, how we're going to defeat the rebels. And if you have a peace process in place, but your defense ministry is producing documents about and plans for crushing the party that you're trying to make peace with, obviously that doesn't inspire a great deal of confidence that you're going to live up to your obligations within those agreements. So I think that, and finally, Djene made a great point. For people in Crimea, it wasn't just a question, do you go with Russia or do you go with Ukraine? Do you go with a Russia that's maybe repressive, that is maybe poorer than the EU, but is stable, is growing economically, has opportunities for you, allows some predictability and regularity in your life? Or do you go with the mess that is post-Maidan Ukraine, where anything could happen? And you don't have to be a Russian irredentist to make the call for Russian annexation on purely pragmatic grounds.
Maybe let's stay 1 second in Crimea and then maybe fast forward to the situation today, because what we actually want to talk about is Europe's role in all this. But one question that I have: why Crimea? I mean, he's still insisting until today that one of the demands that he's putting up on the table to, I don't know, stop this war or talk about ceasefire is the recognition that Crimea belongs to Russia. So that's a really big deal. And you also just explained how that's a big freaking deal also for the Ukrainians. Now, I do buy them, and I do see how the nationalist and ethnical ideology will fuel all of this and will actually, like, on the ground be able to move people too. But is there also let's say, a geopolitical, maybe an economical reason why Crimea is so important? I mean, why not just build the freaking port somewhere else? Why is this port there so important? And what does the gas have to do with all of this?
Well, I would say in terms of the Crimea as a piece of territory, it is perfectly placed in the Black Sea to have a commanding military presence there. I'm not a super expert on the coast, but as far as I understand, also the ports and the terrain on that part of the Black Sea are favorable to maintaining a fleet. For example, it's not necessarily the same if you go to the eastern edge of the Black Sea. So it's like an island, or almost like an island in the middle of the Black Sea that controls the access to
Slavic Gibraltar.
Yeah,
you see it next to your face now on the map here.
Yeah, exactly. You look at it in the map. It is a very strategic piece of territory, and of course, Russia has all this infrastructure already invested in it, and its navy already invested in it. I mean, getting a warm water port was one of the main strategic objectives of the Russians, and the Black Sea was for a long time their, main warm water port in Europe. So I think there's a strong strategic argument. Kuba probably knows better than I on this, but it's not simply a matter of moving the port. It would be ceding a very central piece of territory that basically affords Russia a dominant position in the Black Sea.
Yes, the Crimea is much better than basically, if you needed to have a port on the northern edge of the Black Sea, your first choice would be Crimea. Your second choice, if you can't have Crimea, would be Odessa, which is even deeper in the Ukraine. And the Russian ports are largely on the Sea of Azov, which, without control of Crimea, can be closed by whoever controls Crimea because of the very narrow Strait of Kerch that could be fortified and used to block in any ships that are harbored in the Sea of Azov. So the Crimea is uniquely valuable strategically, and its value increases all the more when you think of area defense, anti-access area defense, area denial weapons, missile systems, things like the S-500, the new Russian anti-air missile system, anti-ship missiles. If you base them there, then you basically command the entire Black Sea. Nobody can move in it freely without your tacit consent. But what happens if you don't have it? Because the alternative, if Russia doesn't control Crimea, is not that Iceland controls Crimea or Mongolia controls Crimea, some innocuous third country. It would be a Crimea in the hands of a pro-NATO Ukraine, where they could be the ones basing ships. They could be the ones putting in the missile systems and the anti-access area denial defensive platforms that would then project well into Russian territory. So the Crimea is essential. And finally, there's the political history of it, which is that Crimea only became part of Ukraine through a purely ceremonial bequest from Nikita Khrushchev on some important Soviet anniversary. It was taken as an entirely symbolic gesture, which was never thought to have any future impact. And I think that part of the reason why the Crimea is so important for Putin is that he wants to establish the precedent that what Russia gives, Russia can take away. If the Crimea was once Russian, it can be Russian again, since there's no organic Ukrainian claim beyond this Khrushchev era bequest.
So I've been, and the last, I mean, maybe a thing that I would add or ask you about, if you know something about that, because I've been studying this a little bit in the last couple of days, researching on that. Because what I came to know was that in 2012, actually, like 1 or 2 years before the whole crisis in the Ukraine started, they became aware, Ukrainians became aware, and also extraction companies in Ukraine from the West became aware that there are huge gas reserves just in front of the Isle of Crimea. Also, interestingly, in the Donbas region and Lugansk region, and also, interestingly, in the West, where some of the battles are raging right now. So one of the, and there were actually already contracts starting between Shell, for example, in Ukraine and some other American industries to start tapping those reserves, because that's the only thing that Ukraine doesn't have, which is the ability, the logistics, the technology, and the material to actually bring all that gas out. Now, the thing is that Russia is like an economy that is nearly entirely dependent on their energy sales, right? On their gas sales to, especially to Europe. I think 50% of German energy comes from Russia or something like that. So having Ukraine as this new Europe, close to Europe, close to NATO, maybe even potentially a NATO ally, now suddenly on the plan with, like, I don't know, the third biggest gas reserves in Europe, at least. That's a huge danger for Russia's future profits and economy, I would think. So what do you think, were these ideas considerations also when going into Ukraine right now and saying, okay, we're going to seize that thing?
I think that those would be secondary factors, apart from the cultural, historic, symbolic, and geopolitical considerations which come first. One reason why I think that is Russia signed agreement with China before the war, during the Olympics, for China to act as a purchaser of last resort for Russian energy that gets sequestered as a result of sanctions. So I think that further, the way that the world energy system is moving, and natural gas is in many ways seen as the least objectionable fossil fuel source. If you're looking for a hydrogen economy, then blue hydrogen, which is hydrogen derived from natural gas with its carbon sequestered, is one of the most feasible medium-term alternatives to fossil fuels. And that and Ukraine has been integrated in European planning documents as a potential producer of hydrogen for the EU market as part of its decarbonization strategy. The demand for natural gas, I think, is so great and increasing that Russia doesn't have to worry about Ukrainian gas sort of leaving it behind and eating up its market share. All of that gas is going to find buyers. And this war, from the perspective of gas profits and from the perspective of Russian energy politics,
sure, it's devastating.
Is much worse, much worse than just letting the Ukrainians have those fields. So I think that one reason to take the claims that Putin makes seriously about his reasons for the conflict, meaning security concerns and this vision of the Russian world, a reordering of the international relationships in Eurasia, is that he has been willing to accept an enormous price economically in order to embark on this conflict. And you don't do that if the goal was some kind of resource grab. Far from being able to profit from Ukrainian natural gas sources, Russia is in a position where the Europeans won't buy their gas anymore. And the Chinese, that's a alternative which keeps the Russian economy viable, but it is a very difficult adjustment to make. The infrastructure isn't necessarily there at a large enough scale, and it's going to be costly, and also it makes you dependent on China, which not a wonderful position to be.
But at the same time, if we look at the news in Germany today, at least, they have brought out a statement. I'm not entirely sure who it was, but it was an official statement that Germany is not going to back off from gas buys from Russia. So there was a lot of saber rattling in the beginning. And of course, there's Nord Stream 2, which is a huge deal. So that's probably on ice for at least a while. But the gas is still going to flow here. So kind of need it because all the other gas that we are getting, especially from the US, is just so much more expensive. And here we started slowly to get into the territory of what
I would also add like a little theory point here. I think vulgar Marxists often are looking for some direct extractive reason that a war happens, whether, you know, they're like trying to steal this resource or this arms manufacturer that is involved. And I think that's a misreading of, you know, a Marxist understanding of history. Of course, economic factors shape and constrain the actions of states, especially you know, not just capitalist states, but all states. But it's rarely to the same 1-to-1 ratio that people like to think. Grand strategy and strategic factors do come into play as states are governed by actors who view the world in that particular way. So, of course, economic factors have a role. There are always economic things, but it's rarely this crude. I mean, it happens, but it is not always the crude resource grab. And, you know, I think Kuba and I have talked about this before. A lot of people will go, the Americans are all in Afghanistan because there's billions of dollars of minerals underneath. There's billions of dollars of minerals under every fucking country, right? You know, the Americans are not in Afghanistan.
Many of which are much easier to conquer and exploit than Afghanistan.
They weren't in Afghanistan to dig up lapis lazuli and, you know, rare earth minerals, right? And if you think that, you're just wrong, right?
Right.
So people have to be a little bit more nuanced in understanding, you know, when we talk about economics determining or impacting international relations, it is not necessarily the caricature version of crude resource extraction all the time. Although, of course, there are cases where it is, right?
And I was not applying that. I was.
I just wanted to like emphasize that, because very often, you know, people are looking for like, it's all about this.
It's all about the oil.
It's all about this oil.
Yes.
I mean, even the Iraq War wasn't about oil in the way people think it was about oil. Because if it had been about oil, they could have made a deal with Saddam Hussein, who was desperate to make a deal to get his oil out the country.
Also, and they didn't get the oil.
Right.
Yeah, and the Americans didn't get the oil. It all went to Italians and Gazprom and all these other, you know, Eni, I think, made a lot in the South, if I'm not mistaken, and anyone but an American company. So people have to be a little bit nuanced in their understanding of how economics impacts international relations. Now, when we look at Ukraine, of course, you know, we can look at the struggle within Ukraine in an economic sense between a faction of the bourgeoisie that sees its future tied to the European economy and a faction of the bourgeoisie that sees itself attached to the Russian sphere of influence. So, you know, obviously we can put those things in, but like beware of monocausal explanations for complicated geopolitical events.
Yes. No, it's I totally agree. So that the monocausality is not something that we should try to ever embrace. But the thing is that I think in terms of Germany, at least, and now we come a little bit to Europe, if we think about why Germany is caught so much in the middle in this situation, because on the one hand, they are, since 2014, especially under Merkel, they are trying to cater, obviously, the American and the NATO narrative. They have been also vehemently villainizing Putin, villainizing Russia, while at the same time playing this double game of, but we are also trying to, you know, we're trying to de-escalate, and we are also at the same time having all these contracts going on. I mean, Gerhard Schröder he basically set up Nord Stream 2, right? So he's the guy who built that thing together with, of course, some Russians. So Germany is extraordinarily dependent on this energy flows. So how does this influence? How would you read Germany's behavior? And we're going to talk about the other parts of Europe also in a second. In this conflict, especially the one that broke up now in the last 3 weeks.
Germany is an interesting case because within the European Union, it's one of the most status quo actors. The Germany does not have an aggressive expand to the east policy or framework, because on every front it's ambivalent. If you let in Ukraine, maybe it helps our energy and gas situation, and maybe it scores us some points with NATO, but we also have to think about our relationship with Russia. We also have to think about where we get our energy from. And we also have to think about, do we want 2 million, 3 million, 5 million Ukrainians moving west? And as a result, you have a very strong impulse to try to use crises to galvanize Europe, because the European Union works very well for Germany. It works very well for actually a lot of countries if you set your expectations low enough. But for Germany in particular, the EU as constructed is extraordinarily beneficial. So you don't want to disrupt this system, and you also don't want to disrupt the delicate demographic and social and economic balance within Germany that has allowed the country to sort of stay stable and stay governable in a situation where many other states are struggling with extremist ideologies or illiberal governing coalitions or large-scale problems with diversity in their population. So on the one hand, without undermining EU solidarity, you want to do as little as possible in terms of sheltering Ukrainians or investing in the defense of Ukraine. Gerhard Schroeder, my understanding is that much of his staff quit because he was unwilling to suspend his relationship with Russia and with Gazprom specifically. And I think that double impulse, on the one hand, we need to do something to show we're good Europeans. On the other hand, we still have to live with Russia. We still need Russia, is the challenge for Western governments and for the German government especially. Please.
Sure, and I would just add, this is a good example of how economics does shape international affairs, in the fact that it puts concrete material constraints on what a country can do, whatever the sympathies of elements within the German government towards Ukraine, whatever their personal hostility towards the Putin administration might be. There are concrete material realities that they cannot ignore unless they want to pay a very heavy price, which they're not willing to do. So this is a concrete example of how economics puts, let's say, guardrails of the on the ability of a country to maintain a particular policy.
And this is one risk of the sanctions regime. As you impose more and more sanctions, perhaps the desired outcome is something like Iran or Iraq, where Iran, its economic and technological development is severely retarded severely constrained by the sanctions regime imposed internationally. Iraq was basically gutted as a society, its infrastructure, its social services, all ruined through an international sanctions regime. But with a country like Russia, where you have established relationships with other major economies, you have enough of a domestic base to meet your needs, the needs of your population, then you risk decoupling, and that the economic relationships, which may have served as a brake on Russian geostrategic planning, have been severed. So now Russia, since it's already lost those connections, it has nothing more to lose. And that is one danger of imposing too rigid a sanctions regime on Russia. Not just that you might embitter the population and provoke anti-Western nationalist sort of chauvinism, resentment, right, the desire for revenge, but also that it might turn out that a reoriented Russian economy can do very well, and now it's insulated from Western pressure.
Yep. I think one interesting development in Germany, which is happening all the while. I mean, while all these things that we have been talking about now are also true, a thing that is actually going on since a couple of years already, maybe even decades, which is an increasing militarization of German society. And I mean, we had that before sporadically in terms of militarization of the police. That is starting in the US also much more, in Germany much more. Now with this crisis, I think a couple of days after the start of the invasion of Russia, Germany announced that they would meet the 2% goal for the NATO budget, basically, from now on. That's something that Trump was very upset about, that we're not doing that. That's done now. And they announced that there will be 100 billion, in English is a billion, I think, billion euro budget in order to stack up German military capabilities, which is, in terms of military budget, like way ahead of anything, like even including Russia, if you talk about a yearly budget at least, right? So that's a huge move. And just today I read news from the Spiegel on this, that these plans to extend by 100 billion the budget for the military are already on the table since October, since just after the election, and that our new coalition, the so-called traffic light coalition, the Ampelkoalition, already planned that and kept it in secret. And that is also one of the reasons why. And this is fairly good journalism. So this is not just hearsay. That's also one of the reasons why this happened so quickly, because this moment was just taken as, you know, okay, we can do that now because the mood in the country supports that. And that is true, because if you look at surveys, over 60%, up to 70% of the population support those moves, including, you know, sending weapons to Ukraine, etc. And that's also the reason why we in Germany know they call that die Zeitenwende, which means something like the change of times or change of tides, maybe you would call that. Like something has shifted in terms of the military role and the security role that at least that Germany sees for itself in Europe. I think it will be interesting to see what will happen here.
And I think that one major question that Germany will face as it stands up more of its own military capability is, to what extent do you channel your security policy through NATO? To what extent do you channel it through the European Union? To what extent do you keep it a purely national matter? If the rejuvenated German forces are still components of an overall NATO transatlantic coalition, then the prospects for a new security relationship with Russia are fairly limited, because all roads go through Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C. at this point is not a responsible or capable actor. If the EU becomes the vehicle for German security policy, then it's possible that an EU bloc and a Russian bloc might come to understanding which respects both of their interests in a relationship that doesn't depend on an American permission, and doesn't reflect the preoccupations and concerns of the American security establishment. If it's handled at the national level, that's a very, very dangerous development, because it might provoke intra-European security competition, which would, of course, be a reversion to some of the worst trends and worst dysfunctions of European history. So I think that one thing that interests me is the fact that the EU has taken on more of a security role. It has brokered, for instance, the move of fighter planes to the Ukrainian military from Poland, from Bulgaria, from elsewhere in the EU. And the common security and foreign policy has always been a kind of holy grail for European integrationists. This moment may be a watershed where the NATO vision of a transatlantic security compact and the EU vision of an integrated European security policy compete, and one will win out. I'm certainly in favor of the European outcome. I think that would be more stabilizing, and the EU, for all the complaints, for all the legitimate grievances that people have with how it behaves economically, the democracy deficit, etc., it is an achievement to maintain continental peace, even just among its members, which include Portugal, Poland, Ireland, Italy, Spain, countries that have difficult histories and difficult security environments. Maintaining peace among all of this membership is a major achievement, and the economic and social connections that it produces help reduce the risk of those types of conflicts even further. So I think that that's one potential outcome: a strengthened EU with its own security capability. This will also enhance, working through the EU will also enhance the leadership role that Germany enjoys. And I think that Macron and France in general has some diplomatic capacity and some diplomatic will that, together with a greater security capability, might be able to reach agreements with countries like Russia, countries like Turkey, about security arrangements for the region.
And I think with Britain out of the
oh yeah, thank God,
it makes the project a lot easier. Britain is probably going to degenerate quite as a state in a broad sense, and will increasingly be just an adjunct of the United States.
That's my next question, Gene, because I mean, for me, Britain has been, like, I've heard some stuff over Twitter, but they have been fairly quiet, at least for us here. We don't really hear much about Britain's position in all of this.
I mean,
so how's it going on there?
The British press, I mean, the British press is obviously in a hysterical outrage about the war. You know, there's a lot of coverage of the war. In fact, I have not seen. I mean, this is more. There's more of a kind of fervor than after 9/11, for example. So, you know, this is the most concerned I've seen the British about a war. There's a general mass sympathy for the Ukrainians. There is you know, stories of people going to fight in the Ukraine from the UK. I went to Marks and Spencer's the other day. They had a Ukrainian appeal. Of course, the British government are being assholes about letting Ukrainian refugees in. Of course, you know, they've made it very difficult, although they say they're going to simplify it. But of course, you know, the real issue that's going to be coming up in Britain is, of course, the fact that these many of these Russian billionaires with connections to the Kremlin have been stashing their money in London. There's a huge scandal brewing over Chelsea Football Club and Roman Abramovich about, what are they going to do with the club? Chelsea is kind of being sanctioned as a football club. It's going to be put up for sale, but people don't know what to do. There's so much Russian money flying around the United Kingdom. If the British government goes hard to go after Russian money, there's going to be a lot of uncomfortable business connections erased. So there's certainly a widespread hostility towards Russia, and obviously condemnation of the war, because British people are seeing white people getting bombed and killed.
Exactly,
that's a factor, because people didn't give that much of a shit when it was like Syrians getting bombed by.
No, there was even this British reporter. Was it British? I think so. That explicitly stated that, right? That those are civilized people, blue-eyed, blonde hair, blah blah blah.
Yeah. So there's enormous amount of sympathy for the Ukrainians, and Putin is a much, he's a much better bad guy. He's a bad guy that people can comprehend, like a terrorist organization.
He's a villain, yeah. He's a villain.
Yeah, like a terrorist organization, you can envisage them as a bad guy, but they're more like a criminal bad guy, right? They're more, they're at the end of the day, in terms of power levels, they're the rebels and you're the empire, even if they're the bad guys, right? ISIS were like evil, infiltrating, terrible, people, but there was never a doubt. There was never thought that, oh no, the ISIS are going to roll in and conquer London, right? But Putin, the Russian state, that's something that people can comprehend and can fit into the only historical mold that they know, which is World War II. And so there's a lot of World War II referencing. There's a lot of, if you don't stop Putin here, he's going to be at Calais in 3 weeks. So, in Britain, there's like a very, there's a very heavy focus on this war. And although there's racist overtones to the coverage of this conflict when compared with what we've seen of the absolutely abominable conflict that's taken place in Syria. But of course, people are going to be worried because this is a huge interstate war in the European continent. So of course, people are going to be worried about this. There are lots of people of Ukrainian origin or Russian origin or Eastern European origin in the United Kingdom. About so not to say that there aren't lots of Middle Eastern people in the thing, but in the country, but there are lots of connections, and for better or for worse, it is what it is. And yes, of course, it's nationalist, racist, and exclusionary, but Ukrainians are kind of seen as not quite 100% the same as you. Closer than, for example.
Yeah.
Although the perversity is that part of the Brexit vote was motivated precisely because the Eastern Europeans, Ukrainians included, but also
there's such a deep rooted racism against Eastern Europeans in Germany too, which is also allowed suddenly poof, it's gone apparently.
One of the ministers, when the crisis first broke out, literally suggested that refugees should apply if they need to get here in a hurry for the seasonal worker visa scheme. So, I wouldn't be surprised if some Tory MP is like, we'll be fast tracking mail order brides from the Ukraine or something, because the market for that following the war. I can imagine some utterly racist stereotype nonsense coming out of these people. But of course,
you're willing to sign your indenture papers, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Guys, we got to end this in like 5 minutes. I just want to ask one more question because also Kuba, that's where he is from. That's where I am from, Poland. It's remarkable to see how Poland just like 2 months ago, basically like fencing off their country to the Belarus side, shooting people there, pushing them back, putting them in cages, etc. Like very, very violent images on how they are actually dealing with refugees that are, by the way, also white, right? So at least Slavic white, let's say. And now the reaction towards Ukrainian people, and also how they are being stylized, at least in German media, as, you know, look at the Polish reaction. Wow, they are so humanitarian, etc., etc. What's going on there? What's their game in all this?
It's really nice to hear the Germans say anything nice about Poland.
Yes.
So
yes, thank you. Exactly.
So I mean, I'm going to take that as a win.
Yeah.
There is a significant difference between the Belarus refugee case, which is that the refugees coming over the border with Belarus largely were from outside of the region. Right. Many from the Middle East, some from Africa and elsewhere. That because Belarus began offering transit visas for purchase at its consulates and embassies, precisely to create this humanitarian blackmail,
and also get some U.S. currency too. They were trying to
exactly. It's win-win, right? Like you get the money from the refugees, and you have pressure against Poland and the EU. And the reaction was essentially the same as we saw in 2015 with large refugee flows from the Middle East, which, you know, racist, xenophobic hostility. The Ukrainian refugees, first of all, Poland played a significant role in escalating this crisis by brokering the offer of beginning accession talks with the Yanukovych government in 2013. And that helped mobilize enough normal Ukrainians against Yanukovych in the Maidan uprising to result in his overthrow. The EU dream is very powerful for Eastern Europeans. But largely, in this case, if the Russians are so directly in the root cause, right? If they're driving people from their homes,
right,
especially people that Poles can kind of speak to, that resonance with the Polish historical memory is so great that you feel called to live up to these Polish traditional notions of like honor and humanity and hospitality, which are inconsistently applied, but which the culture does treasure. And I think that because this is an ongoing conflict against Russia, and Polish people admire the underdog that's willing to resist, that's willing to fight, that there's going to be a fairly sizable reservoir of goodwill for the Ukrainians, and any kind of military or security support that Poland can offer, the Ukrainians just need to ask. There's no fly zone that Poland can will into existence, but anything short of that, for instance, convoys of ammunition, the replacement aircraft, things like that, Poland is going to provide that, and may eventually, depending on the course of the war how the course of the war goes, may eventually be the location of a Ukrainian Zelensky government in exile, in case occupation, the country's occupied fully before there's a diplomatic resolution.
Right. Okay, guys, I mean, it's been like 1.5 hours. We haven't, surprise, surprise, we haven't been able to cover everything. But that was really great. Like, would you be willing to come on again in a couple of weeks and keep discussing? Because I think there's still
it would be an honor. We love seeing our fraternal German comrades.
Yeah, after all, Kurdish, Polish, German rapprochement, right? This could be a power alliance in the making.
Yeah, we're setting the groundstones here. Yes, okay. Guys, thanks a lot for coming here. This has been a Patreon live stream. We are going to broadcast this on Sunday, so I will send you the link for that again if you want to host that on your social media or so. Please do so.
Will do.
Okay, great. Thanks, guys, and have a nice evening. See you soon, right?
Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Leute, wir brauchen eure Hilfe. Wenn euch dieses Video gefallen hat, klickt auf Like, abonniert den Kanal und vergesst nicht das Glöckchen zu drücken, damit ihr benachrichtigt werdet, wenn wir neuen Content droppen.
Außerdem solltet ihr uns überall folgen, wo wir verfügbar sind. Das ist Facebook, Instagram, Twitter und Twitch. Und wenn wir irgendwelche Ankündigungen machen oder Posts, dann shared, was das Zeug hält. Gebt uns all eure Liebe.
Wir haben mittlerweile ziemlich signifikante Kosten. Wenn ihr es euch irgendwie leisten könnt, unterstützt uns doch auf Patreon. Dann kommt ihr auch in den Genuss verschiedener Vorteile, wie zum Beispiel Zugang zu unserer Discord-Community oder Zugang zu den ultrageheimen Patreon-Episoden, die wir dort posten. Außerdem könnt ihr uns natürlich auch über PayPal Spenden zukommen lassen.
Außerdem haben wir mittlerweile einen eigenen Online-Shop. Das heißt, wenn ihr euch immer noch fragt, was ihr euren Lieben zu Weihnachten, Ostern oder sonst wie schenken könnt, geht dorthin und kauft duftes Merch.
Alle Links dazu hier in der Beschreibung oder auch auf unserer Webseite 99zu1.de.
Vielen Dank fürs Dabeisein, danke für die Unterstützung und wir sehen uns in diesem Theater.